Yes, Ohio and Michigan did argue over a strip of land. People call it the Toledo War. It was not a war with big battles or many dead soldiers. It was more a fight over maps and who owned what. But it felt very real to the people living there. Both sides got ready to fight. Both sides sent out their militias. Leaders on both sides were very stubborn. This all happened in the 1830s. The United States was still quite young. States and territories were growing fast. New lands were opening up all the time. Knowing exactly where one state ended and another began was important. It meant taxes, it meant laws, it meant political power. It was about who controlled the future. The land in question was a strip about 5 to 8 miles wide. It ran for many miles, stretching from the Indiana border all the way to Lake Erie. This strip included the city of Toledo. Toledo was not a big city then, not yet, but it had a key spot. It was right at the mouth of the Maumee River. This river flowed directly into Lake Erie. This location was perfect for trade. It offered a natural harbor, a deep bay, and easy access to both the Great Lakes and the interior of Ohio. It was clear even then that this spot would be a hub for canals and eventually railroads. So owning Toledo was a very big deal. Both Ohio and Michigan wanted it badly. They saw it as vital for their economic future. If Ohio was a state already, it became a state in 1803. Michigan was still a territory. It was trying hard to become a state. For Michigan, getting this land was about its future statehood and its economic viability. It was about being a strong, complete state. For Ohio, keeping this land was about its honor. It was about what they believed was already theirs. It was about maintaining its established boundaries. The problem started way back with old maps, or really with how people read those maps and the laws that describe them. When the United States was forming, the Northwest Territory was huge. It covered much of what is now Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. The government made rules for how this vast land would be divided into new states. These rules were in something called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This was a foundational document for the expansion of the country. The ordinance talked about lines. It said Ohio's northern border would be an east-west line. This line would start at the southern tip of Lake Michigan, then it would run straight east. It would go all the way to Lake Erie. This sounds simple. It seemed clear enough at the time. But it was not. It turned out to be anything but simple. No one really knew where the southern tip of Lake Michigan was back then. Not exactly. Maps were not perfect. They were hand-drawn. They were based on incomplete surveys or even guesses. Surveyors had not been everywhere. Much of the land was still wilderness, so different people had different ideas about where that initial point on Lake Michigan truly was. And a small difference at the start of the line meant a big difference by the time that line reached Lake Erie. Even a slight error in the initial measurement could shift the entire border by miles when it was projected across a large area. So Ohio believed its border was further north. Michigan believed its border was further south. That space in between was the disputed land. It was called the Toledo Strip, and it was big enough to cause a lot of trouble. People living in this strip did not know who their true government was. They were caught in the middle. They did not know who to pay taxes to. They did not know whose laws to follow. They faced being taxed by both sides. They faced confusion in legal matters. It was a messy situation for them, and it got much worse before it got better. Their daily lives were disrupted by this official indecision. The story of the Toledo War is about more than just land. It is about states growing up. It is about pride. It is about law. And it is about people willing to stand up for what they believed was right. Even if that meant facing off against their neighbors. It shows how even small disagreements can turn into big problems when no one wants to back down. This conflict shaped the maps we know today. It changed how Michigan looks, giving it its distinctive Upper Peninsula. And it settled Ohio's border for good. And it left a lasting story for both states, a point of shared, sometimes humorous, historical rivalry. This was a time when the young nation was finding its way. There were no clear answers for every border dispute. Things were being worked out as they went along, and sometimes that meant a little fighting. Or at least a lot of shouting and showing off. The Toledo War shows us how tricky that process could be. It was a time of growth, it was a time of argument, and it was a time when maps truly mattered. The simple lines on paper became lines in the dirt, and people were ready to defend those dirt lines with force. The roots of this problem were deep. They went back to colonial charters, they went back to early American laws, and they mixed with local pride and political ambition. The stage was set for a showdown. Two ambitious governors, two proud populations, one valuable piece of land, and no easy way to split it. This was the start of the Toledo War, and it would take a president to finally stop it. The tension was building, and soon it would boil over. The trouble started with old documents. Really old ones. British colonial charters gave land to different colonies. These charters often described borders in vague ways. They used landmarks that were not always clear, like to the first great bend of the river or to the mountains. When America became a country, these old descriptions caused many border disputes between the new states. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 was an attempt to fix some of this. It set up rules for how new states would be formed from the vast, largely unsettled Northwest Territory. This was a critical piece of legislation for the young republic. The ordinance specifically said that 3 to 5 states could be formed from this territory. It also tried to define their borders clearly. For the northern border of the southernmost tier of states, which would include Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, it set a key line. This line would start at the southern tip of Lake Michigan. Then it would run due east to Lake Erie. If this seemed like a good logical plan on paper, it aimed for a straight, easily identifiable line. But here was the big central problem. No one knew exactly where the southern tip of Lake Michigan was. Not precisely. Maps of the time were not perfect. They were often based on explorers' rough sketches or incomplete surveys. Surveying was hard work. It was slow. It involved traversing dense forests and wetlands. And it was not always accurate given the tools available. When Ohio was made a state in 1803, its state constitution used the Northwest Ordinance line as its northern border. But Ohio leaders, shrewd politicians that they were, added a crucial twist. They worried that if the line was drawn exactly as stated in the ordinance, based on the actual, still unknown, southern tip of Lake Michigan, a large part of its desired territory, especially the vital Maumee River area, would be lost to the future state of Michigan. This would cut Ohio off from a valuable port and much fertile land. So, in Ohio's Statehood Act, they put in a condition. And they said if the southern tip of Lake Michigan was found to be south of the southernmost point of Lake Erie, which it was widely suspected to be, then their northern border would instead be a line drawn from that southern tip of Lake Michigan directly to the northernmost cape of Maumee Bay. This would effectively shift the border several miles north, ensuring Ohio kept the Maumee River mouth and what would become Toledo. This Michigan clause was a clever, preemptive move by Ohio. It gave them a legal basis to claim more land if the original line did not favor them. It was a gamble. The U.S. Congress approved Ohio's constitution with this clause, but they did not specifically say whether the Michigan clause was valid or not. They just let it pass, perhaps not fully understanding the implications or hoping the issue would resolve itself. They were busy with other matters. This lack of a clear, definitive federal ruling left the door wide open for future arguments. And it would cause huge headaches later. It was a ticking time bomb. In 1812, a surveyor named Andrew Ellicott was hired by the federal government. He was supposed to find the southern tip of Lake Michigan. He did his best, but his survey was not entirely accurate by modern standards. He placed the tip much further north than Ohio had hoped. His work showed that the original Northwest Ordinance line would indeed place the Toledo area firmly within what would become Michigan. This made Ohio very unhappy. This seemed to confirm their worst fears about the original wording. Then came another survey. In 1817, a man named William Harris surveyed a line for Ohio. This Harris line followed Ohio's preferred northern route. It ran from the northernmost cape of Maumee Bay, cutting across the land in a straight line west. This line clearly claimed the Toledo Strip for Ohio. Ohio leaders vigorously pushed for this line. They said it was the true and rightful boundary, justified by their Statehood Act. But Michigan disagreed just as strongly. Michigan was created as a territory in 1805. Its territorial act also used the original Northwest Ordinance language for its southern boundary. Its people believed the original line, the one starting from the southern tip of Lake Michigan and running due east, was correct. They called this the Fulton Line, after another early surveyor, John Fulton, who confirmed Ellicott's findings. This line was several miles south of the Harris Line. The land between these two lines was the disputed territory. It was about 8 miles wide at its widest point, and it was very desirable land, vital for a growing territory. For years, the federal government did little to solve the problem. They had other, more pressing things to worry about. The country was expanding rapidly. There were ongoing conflicts with Native American tribes on the frontier. There was the War of 1812, which consumed much of the nation's attention and resources. The border dispute just sat there, simmering, largely ignored by Washington, D.C. But as Michigan grew in population and as it pushed more and more for statehood, the issue became urgent. Our Michigan wanted to become a full state, but it needed clear, undisputed borders to do so. The people in the Toledo Strip were in an impossible situation. They did not know if they were Michiganders or Ohioans. They faced double taxation. Both governments tried to collect taxes from them, both tried to enforce their own distinct laws. They had two sets of elected officials claiming authority. It was chaos for them. Their property rights were unclear, their legal standing was uncertain. In 1835, Michigan was finally ready to become a state. It held a constitutional convention. Its proposed constitution included the Fulton Line as its southern border. This put Toledo firmly in Michigan. Ohio, led by its strong governor, Robert Lucas, was not going to let that happen without a fight. Lucas was a former surveyor himself. He was very firm in his belief that the Harris Line was the correct boundary. He saw this as a matter of Ohio's legal rights and its economic future. He was an experienced politician, a former general in the Ohio militia, and he was not one to back down. Michigan's territorial governor was Stevens T. Mason. He was young, charismatic, and ambitious. And he was also very determined. Mason, nicknamed the boy governor because he was only 23 years old when he took office, believed just as strongly that the land belonged to Michigan. He saw it as his duty to protect Michigan's claim, to stand up for his people. He was fiercely loyal to Michigan's interests. So, you had two strong leaders, both absolutely convinced they were right. Both had a legal basis for their claims, however convoluted those claims might be. One based on a conditional clause in an old constitution that Congress had implicitly approved. The other based on the original wording of a founding federal document, the Northwest Ordinance. And in between them was a valuable strip of land, a strip with a vital port. This was not just a map problem anymore. It was a clash of wills, it was a fight for economic future, and it was about to get very heated. The polite disagreements were ending. Action and potentially confrontation was coming next. Things got very serious in early 1835. Michigan was pushing hard for statehood. Its proposed constitution included the Fulton Line as its southern border, which put Toledo squarely in Michigan. Ohio's Governor Lucas was not having any of it. He believed the Harris Line, which put Toledo in Ohio, was the correct boundary. He was a man of action, and he was ready to fight for what he saw as Ohio's rightful claim. He was determined to assert Ohio's jurisdiction over the Strip. Governor Lucas acted first and decisively. In February 1835, Ohio passed a law. It created Lucas County. This new county was named after the governor himself, a clear act of defiance. And it was entirely within the disputed Toledo Strip. This was a very clear message to Michigan. Ohio claimed that land, and Ohio intended to govern it. Ohio also ordered a new survey of the Harris Line. They wanted to make it official. They wanted to mark it clearly with permanent stakes and blazed trees. This was a direct provocation. Michigan's Governor Mason saw this as an outright invasion of Michigan territory. He was furious, feeling Ohio was openly disrespecting Michigan's claims and federal law. He quickly got the Michigan territorial legislature to pass its own laws in response. One law, called the Pains and Penalties Act, made it a crime for any Ohio official to exercise authority in the disputed territory. It carried harsh penalties, fines up to $1,000 and up to 5 years in jail. Mason was sending his own clear message: obey Michigan law or face the consequences. He also called up the Michigan militia. He planned to physically stop the Ohio surveyors. He would protect Michigan's land, with force if necessary. He was young, but he was resolute. And Ohio sent its surveyors to mark the Harris Line. The surveying party was led by a man named John A. Bryan. They were accompanied by a small armed guard of Ohioans, perhaps 30 to 50 men. Governor Mason, hearing of this, sent Sheriff Joseph Wood of Monroe County, Michigan, to stop them. So Wood had a posse with him, also armed, estimated to be around 50 to 60 men. On April 12, 1835, the Ohio Survey Party was near the present-day city of Phillips Corners, just west of Sylvania, Ohio. They were actively marking trees and setting stakes. Sheriff Wood and his Michigan posse found them. There was a tense standoff. Words were exchanged, threats were made, guns were openly displayed on both sides. The Michigan men were angry and determined. They arrested some of the Ohio surveyors and their guards, taking about 10 of them into custody. They also fired a few shots in the air, a warning. No one was seriously hurt during the initial confrontation, although there was a minor scuffle where a Michigan deputy was stabbed in the leg with a penknife by an Ohioan resisting arrest. It was a very minor injury, more of a scratch, but it was the closest they came to actual bloodshed. This event became known as the Battle of Phillips Corners, though skirmish or scuffle is a more accurate term. But it showed how incredibly tense things had become. The potential for a real shooting war was there. After this, Governor Lucas responded with even more force. He was not intimidated. He called for a special session of the Ohio legislature. He asked for money and men to defend Ohio's perceived rights. So Ohio quickly created its own large militia, which they proudly called the Toledo War Militia. As thousands of Ohioans volunteered to serve, showing the widespread support for Ohio's claim. Lucas even went to Toledo himself, riding with his troops. He wanted to show Ohio's resolve in person. He wanted to be seen as leading the charge. He also ordered the establishment of Ohio courts in the disputed territory, appointing judges and holding sessions. He wanted Ohio's laws to be enforced, and he wanted Michigan to see that Ohio meant business. Michigan was not backing down either. Governor Mason stationed his militia, numbering around 1,200 men, at strategic points along the disputed border. They guarded against Ohio's advances and continued efforts to survey the line. He also appealed directly to President Andrew Jackson, the sitting president of the United States. Mason wanted Jackson to side with Michigan. He wanted Jackson to use federal power to stop Ohio's aggressive actions. He believed federal law clearly supported Michigan. President Jackson was in a very tough spot. He was a Democrat, and he liked Governor Lucas. Lucas was a fellow Democrat and a respected political figure. But Jackson knew the Northwest Ordinance was a federal law. He also knew Michigan's claim had strong legal standing based on that ordinance. He could not simply ignore Michigan. It was a tough balancing act politically. He needed to find a solution that wouldn't alienate too many people. Jackson sent two federal commissioners to the region, Richard Rush and Benjamin Butler. Their job was to try and mediate the dispute. They were to investigate the claims and try to get both governors to agree to a temporary truce. They wanted them to let the federal government decide the issue to calm things down. Governor Lucas, after some initial reluctance, agreed to the truce. He likely understood the political wisdom of appearing cooperative with the president. But Governor Mason did not. He felt Michigan was clearly in the right, that the law was on their side. He feared a truce would weaken Michigan's claim, suggesting that their legal position was negotiable. Mason continued to assert Michigan's authority in the Toledo Strip. He continued to arrest Ohioans who tried to enforce Ohio law. He issued warrants for the arrest of Lucas and other Ohio officials, though these were never served. This made President Jackson very angry. He saw Mason's actions as insubordination, a direct challenge to federal authority. He removed Mason from his post as territorial governor in August 1835. Jackson appointed a new governor, John S. Horner, hoping to install someone more compliant. But the people of Michigan stood by Mason. They were loyal to their young leader. They held new elections, and in a remarkable show of popular support, they re-elected Mason as their governor, despite Jackson's removal. This showed Jackson that Michigan was united behind its young leader. It also showed Jackson the depth of feeling in Michigan regarding the disputed land. Despite Mason's removal and the appointment of Horner, the arrests continued. Michigan officials were determined. One notable incident involved a Michigan justice of the peace. He famously tried to arrest a whole Ohio court in the disputed territory. He entered the courtroom during a session, intending to arrest the judge and jury for violating Michigan's Pains and Penalties Act. This was a bold, almost farcical move. It clearly showed the ongoing clash of authorities, the legal and political entanglement of the situation. The situation became, at times, ridiculous. Both sides claimed the same piece of land. They both tried to govern it. People were confused, they were scared, they just wanted to know who was in charge. The dispute was also costly. Both Ohio and Michigan spent a lot of money on their militias, on legal fees, and on administrative efforts in the Strip. It was a waste of resources for both a young state and a developing territory. It tied up federal attention. The federal government needed a real, permanent solution. It was clear that neither side would give up. Neither governor would back down on their own terms. The war was not a shooting war in the conventional sense, but it was a war of legal claims. It was a war of political maneuvering. It was a war of pride and stubbornness. And it needed a resolution from the highest level of government. The next step had to come from Washington, D.C. It was the only way to end this ongoing, embarrassing border feud. The heat was on President Jackson and Congress to fix this mess, to bring stability to the region. The Toledo War was getting expensive, politically messy, and frankly, a bit embarrassing for the young nation. President Andrew Jackson knew he had to act decisively. The federal government could not allow two of its states or territories to fight like this, creating instability and potentially leading to real bloodshed. Plus, Michigan really wanted to become a state, but Congress had made it clear it would not grant statehood until the border dispute was settled permanently. Jackson understood Ohio's political power very well. Ohio was a rapidly growing state with a large population and many electoral votes. It was a key swing state for his Democratic Party. Its delegation in Congress was strong and influential. So he could not simply ignore Ohio's claims, which had some legal basis in their state constitution. But Michigan also had a strong argument based on the original language of the Northwest Ordinance, a foundational federal law. It was a tough balancing act politically. He had to keep both sides, and their respective supporters in Congress somewhat satisfied. In 1836, Congress started to seriously tackle the problem. They knew a simple ruling for one side would cause too much anger in the other. They needed a compromise. This was not easy. Ohio still firmly wanted the Toledo Strip, seeing it as essential for its future growth. Michigan still believed it was rightfully theirs, based on the original federal mandate. The compromise had to offer something substantial, something big, to Michigan to make it willingly give up the incredibly valuable Toledo Strip. And so Congress came up with a bold trade. They proposed that Michigan would get a large tract of land to its north. This was the vast western part of the Upper Peninsula. At the time, this land was considered wilderness. It was cold, it was rugged, it was covered in dense forests. Most people did not think it was worth much at all. Many described it dismissively. It was called a frozen, uninhabitable waste by some members of Congress. Others called it a region of perpetual snows or a barren waste where Indians could not live. It seemed like a very poor trade for the fertile farmlands and the invaluable port of Toledo. But this new land, this seemingly worthless territory, turned out to be incredibly rich. It was full of valuable timber, enough to fuel a logging industry for decades, and, more importantly, it held vast, untapped deposits of copper and iron ore. These were resources that would become critical for the Industrial Revolution. This was a huge, unexpected bonus for Michigan. At the time of the compromise, they did not know the true immense value of the Upper Peninsula. But later, it would become a source of immense wealth for Michigan, shaping its economy and identity for generations. Michigan was very reluctant to accept this deal. Governor Mason and the people of Michigan felt cheated. They thought they were giving up a thriving, fertile port area for an icy, remote wasteland. They held a special convention in September 1836 in Ann Arbor to vote on the offer. They overwhelmingly rejected it. They voted no. They did not want the Upper Peninsula. They wanted Toledo, the land they felt was rightfully theirs. Their pride and their perceived legal right fueled their defiance. But Congress was firm. They reiterated that Michigan could not become a state without accepting the compromise. The federal government needed to settle the border. They needed stability in the region. The pressure on Michigan was immense. The territory was in financial trouble. They were eager for statehood benefits, which included federal funds for roads and canals, and the right to participate in federal elections. Statehood would bring federal funds. It would give them a voice in Congress, 2 senators, and a representative. Continuing as a territory meant limited self-governance and dependence on federal funding. So, a second convention was held in December 1836 in Ann Arbor. This one was unofficial, called by a more moderate faction. It was scornfully referred to as the Frostbitten Convention by those who still opposed the compromise. This time, after heated debate and under immense federal pressure, delegates voted to accept the compromise. They did so with heavy hearts, feeling coerced. Many people felt it was unfair that they were being bullied. But they also knew they had no other practical choice. They needed statehood more than they could stubbornly hold out for Toledo. The economic and political consequences of remaining a territory were too great. With Michigan's acceptance, Congress passed the final acts. Ohio officially kept the Toledo Strip. Its northern border was confirmed as the Harris Line, solidifying its claim. Michigan officially received the western Upper Peninsula. And with its borders finally settled, Michigan officially became a state on January 26, 1837. It was the 26th state to join the Union. This was the end of the Toledo War. It was not a grand military victory for anyone, but a hard-fought political solution. It was a compromise forced by the federal government to ensure national unity and stability. If Ohio got the land it wanted, land it had fought for with intense determination, Michigan got statehood, and a large, valuable piece of land it did not initially want, but which would prove to be its greatest economic asset. The resolution had profound and lasting effects. It shaped the geography of both states in unique ways. Ohio's distinctive handle, or panhandle, in the northwest corner, where Toledo sits, is a direct result of this conflict. And Michigan's unique two-part shape, with its upper peninsula connected by a narrow land bridge, also comes directly from this compromise. Without the Toledo War, Michigan might have looked very different on the map. It might not have had the vast natural resources that later made it rich. The whole affair showed the power and authority of the federal government. It showed how it could step in to settle disputes between states and territories, even using strong armed tactics when necessary. It successfully prevented a full-blown war between two growing populations. It made both sides grumble. But it brought a definitive peace and resolved a dangerous contention, and it allowed both Ohio and Michigan to move forward as full integrated members of the United States. The political maneuvering was complex. The pressure was real. But in the end, a deal was struck. And the borders were finally permanently drawn, ending decades of uncertainty. The Toledo War ended with a major political compromise, not a clear military victory for either side. Ohio kept the Toledo Strip. Michigan received the vast Upper Peninsula and was granted statehood. This unique political solution had deep and lasting impacts on both states, shaping their geography, economies, and even their cultural identities. For Ohio, keeping the Toledo Strip was a huge win. It secured a crucial port on Lake Erie. Toledo's strategic location at the mouth of the Maumee River proved to be exactly as valuable as Ohio leaders, particularly Governor Lucas, had believed. It quickly developed into a major transportation hub. Canals like the Miami and Erie Canal, then railroads, flow through Toledo, connecting the rich agricultural lands of the Ohio Valley to the Great Lakes and the eastern markets. This strategic position significantly helped Ohio's economy grow strong and vibrant. The distinctive panhandle, or handle shape of northwestern Ohio on the map, is a direct geographic legacy of this border dispute. It is a constant, visible reminder of how hard Ohio fought for that specific piece of land. For Michigan, the initial feeling was definitely one of loss and resentment. Giving up Toledo, which they firmly believed was theirs by federal law, felt like a bitter defeat. Governor Mason and many Michiganders felt forced into the deal, believing they had been unfairly treated by Congress and President Jackson. They saw the Upper Peninsula as a poor trade, a desolate, unproductive wilderness. But time revealed the true, incredible value of their frozen waste. The Upper Peninsula turned out to be astonishingly rich in natural resources. Its vast, ancient forests provided timber that fueled a massive logging industry for many decades. More importantly, it held huge, easily accessible deposits of copper and iron ore. These resources became critical for the nation's industrial development, particularly during the Industrial Revolution and later during both World Wars. The Upper Peninsula transformed into an economic powerhouse, providing raw materials that made Michigan a wealthy and industrially important state. It also gave Michigan its unique two-peninsula shape, setting it apart geographically. This geographic feature defines Michigan's identity even today. The people who live in the Upper Peninsula are fiercely proud of their unique region and are affectionately called Yoopers, a distinct cultural group within Michigan, directly a result of the Toledo War's compromise. The Toledo War also had a broader impact on the young United States. It clearly demonstrated the federal government's crucial role in resolving interstate conflicts. President Jackson and Congress stepped in directly to prevent a wider, potentially violent conflict between a state and a territory. This action set a powerful precedent. It showed that the federal government had the ultimate authority to mediate and enforce solutions in state border disputes, even if it meant strong-arming one party. This was vital for the young nation, which needed to show that it could manage internal conflicts peacefully and maintain national unity. It proved that the system could work even under duress. The war itself was mostly bluster, legal maneuvering, and shows of force. There were no major battles in the conventional sense. Only one person was injured, a Michigan sheriff named Joseph Wood, who suffered a minor stab wound from a penknife during a scuffle. It was certainly not a war with armies clashing and many casualties, but it was a very serious conflict. Both sides mobilized militias, spending considerable public funds. Both sides were ready to escalate. The threat of real violence was present, and the passionate arguments and deep-seated beliefs showed how deeply people cared about land, jurisdiction, and their identity as Ohioans or Michiganders. The tension was very real for those living through it. The memory of the Toledo War lives on in both states. It is a unique and often humorous part of their shared history. It is frequently taught in schools as an example of state-making challenges. It is a story of rivalry, but also a story of how compromises, even difficult ones, are ultimately made to preserve peace. It helped forge the identity of Ohioans and Michiganders, giving them a shared, quirky historical anecdote. It is a reminder of how their states came to be defined. Today, Ohio and Michigan are good neighbors. Their rivalry now mostly plays out on sports fields, especially between their major universities, a much safer and more entertaining contest. The bitterness and animosity of the Toledo War have faded into history, but the historical narrative remains. It is a curious yet profoundly important chapter in American state making. It highlights the complex challenges of drawing lines on a map in a vast developing country. And it shows how those lines, once drawn, can become powerful symbols. Symbols worth fighting for, even if that fighting is more about legal paperwork and political arm twisting than cannons and muskets. The story reminds us that land is not just dirt, it is power, it is resources, it is identity. And sometimes people will go to great lengths to claim what they believe is theirs, even if it means challenging the federal government, even if it means facing down their neighbors with militias. The Toledo War was a unique moment in American history. It taught everyone involved a lot about boundaries. Not just physical boundaries on a map, but also the boundaries of political power and the boundaries of compromise. And in the end, it created the states we know today with their distinct shapes and their shared storied past. It's a tale of stubbornness, ambition, and a surprising turn of events that gifted Michigan an unexpected treasure. It was a war, yes, but of a very specific, very American kind. A war of words, laws, and lines on a map that forever changed the landscape and the destiny of two proud states.